So you've decided you want a chameleon, but you're not sure what the best beginner chameleon is. Keep on watching. This is going to be my opinion on the best beginner chameleon, but I will give you guys some reasons and hopefully you'll be able to understand my thought process and why I'm making this recommendation. So let's get right to it. The best beginner chameleon, in my opinion, is, cue the drum roll, a male veiled or panther chameleon, and I'll give you a few reasons why. The first reason is that there's tons of information on how to take care of them, either a veiled or a panther. They're super common in the chameleon hobby and the reptile hobby, and there's loads and loads of information on how to take care of them properly, including this YouTube channel. So that's going to be the biggest reason why I'm going to recommend one of these two chameleons versus like a Jackson's chameleon. While they are becoming more popular, there's still not as much information about them. Same with like a carpet chameleon or Mellors or Parsons, and you're like, I've never even heard of these chameleons. That's because they're still, like, they're in the hobby, but they're not as popular, so there's not as much care information. If you're watching this video because you want to learn what the easiest chameleon is, then a chameleon may not be the right reptile or species for you. Chameleons take a lot of time, a lot of work, a lot of money, a lot of patience. There isn't really an easy chameleon. What makes veils and panthers appealing is because there's so much information about them, so there's more information to know how to take care of them correctly versus rare species, but they're still not easy, and if you're looking for an easy reptile, I would consider something besides a chameleon. The second reason that I would recommend a veiled or a panther chameleon is because it's very easy to get a captive bred one, which means they were born and bred in captivity versus being plucked from the wild, whether that's in Florida or Hawaii or Madagascar, wherever. If you have a wild-caught chameleon, odds are they have some sort of parasite or underlying health issue, which just lowers their chances of survival and living a happy, healthy life. So you definitely want to get captive bred, and luckily, it's very easy to find a reputable breeder that breeds panthers or veils. I would strongly encourage that you buy from a reputable breeder versus a chain pet store. Reason being is they have stronger genetics. You know, the chameleon's being taken well care of versus the pet store, you know, that isn't always the case. Not to mention, a lot of breeders these days are willing to offer advice and coach you through how to properly set up a chameleon, so you know you're getting good advice from a breeder versus, you know, a pet store employee. So that's another bonus. The next reason why I would recommend a veiled or panther chameleon as your first chameleon is because they don't have crazy space requirements. And I know you're looking back at these enclosures behind me and you're like, what is she talking about? But in the grand scheme of chameleon keeping, veils and panthers have a moderate amount of space that they need. It's not as much as, say, like a yellow lip Parsons chameleon, but it's going to be a bit more than, say, like a carpet chameleon. So it's a nice moderate amount of space. So the recommendation for a veiled or panther chameleon is going to be 2 feet wide by 2 feet deep by a 4 foot tall enclosure. Another nice thing is that they don't need crazy extreme temperatures. There are certain chameleon species that need a significant drop in temperature at night, like down to the low 60s, which can be hard to achieve in captivity and in your home. But luckily, panther and veiled chameleons, while they do need a temperature drop and they do need a range and grading of temperatures, they're pretty easy to achieve in captivity indoors with the use of a heat bulb. So make sure you check out my video all about heat in chameleons to understand the proper gradient that's needed for both a panther and a veiled chameleon. I'm also recommending either a panther or veiled chameleon because they get to a decent size. Parsons are obviously gigantic, you know, they can be up like the size of your entire arm. Pygmy chameleons are like the size of your finger, but a veiled or panther, they're gonna be a nice moderate size, about yay big. I don't know how many inches or centimeters that is, but they get to a decent size, enough to be like, whoa, like that's a cool lizard, you know, that's a cool chameleon. So that's, I think, another benefit and why they'd make for a good beginner chameleon. So my recommendation was for a male chameleon, and we'll get into that, but one of the benefits is that they do live a decent amount of time. Chameleons don't have the reputation of being long-living reptiles, especially when you compare them to some snakes that can live over 20 years. But the textbook answer for a male veiled or panther chameleon is 5 to 7 years. As we're improving our husbandry, we are able to get that number higher. So I have seen chameleons outlive 7 years. I'm rooting for Neptune to live longer than that, but that's a nice happy middle. There are some chameleons that don't live more than a year or two. So I feel like that 5 to 7, whether or not that's an accurate number, because there's some debate right now, like how long can chameleons actually live in captivity, but going off that number, I think that's a good happy middle as we compare to other species. So I briefly touched on that my recommendation is for a male chameleon versus a female chameleon, and don't get me wrong, the colors of a female are absolutely gorgeous. There are some benefits in that they're slightly smaller, they're typically cheaper than males, but the thing is, females do lay eggs. They lay infertile clutches, and that can be somewhat problematic if you're a new keeper and you're not anticipating it or not experienced with egg laying in chameleons, which is why my recommendation is that you go for a male chameleon. This way you don't have to worry about egg laying whatsoever. In addition, the males tend to have brighter, cooler colors. Cooler being subjective though, because some people do have a preference for the female coloration over the male. I think it's also important that we talk about the age of the chameleon that you get. So my recommendation for a beginner chameleon and a beginner keeper is to buy a chameleon that's at least, at the minimum, 3 months old. If you're buying from a breeder who's selling you a chameleon that's under that age, odds are they're not a great breeder, because 3 months is the industry standard for the minimum age needed to sell a chameleon, because that's a good point in which they're pretty established. If you buy a chameleon that's younger than 3 months, they're still in that very fragile state, and any mistakes that you make, odds are the chameleon's not gonna make it. 3 months though is usually a good starting point. And the cool thing about buying a 3-month-old is that you get to see them grow, you get to build that relationship with them, you know, that bond, which can be more difficult to do if you buy an older chameleon. So that's my recommendation if you have the choice. So at this point, we've narrowed it down to a male, 3-month-old, veiled or panther chameleon. But how do you decide between the veiled or the panther? And there's 2 big reasons why people will say you should pick one over the other. One of the big ones being cost. So veileds are significantly cheaper than a panther chameleon. A male panther will easily go for $300. A male veiled you can pick up for $60. So you can see there's a pretty significant price difference between the 2 species. But if you're picking a veiled chameleon just because it's cheaper, then a chameleon may not be the right animal for you. Reason being, the cost of the enclosure is going to be way more than the cost of the chameleon itself. The cost of the vet bill is going to be way more than the cost of the chameleon itself. So if you're deciding that you want a veiled because it's cheaper, because you're trying to save money, chameleon keeping is not the hobby for you. It's very expensive. There's gonna be expenses that come up that you aren't anticipating. So if you're not prepared to pay the full $300 for your chameleon, then you may want to reconsider a different animal. If you end up purchasing a veiled chameleon because that's the chameleon that you want, that's totally fine. I'm just trying to say that you shouldn't base your decision off of price alone. Another thing people will mention when trying to decide between a veiled and a panther is that they think there's a difference in temperament and friendliness and willingness to be handled. The stereotype is that panther chameleons are friendlier than veiled chameleons, that veiled chameleons are more likely to bite you than a panther chameleon. But the thing is it's a total crapshoot in my opinion, because Neptune is super defensive, has tried to bite me multiple times, has actually bitten the vet. Anyone else who tries to handle him, he'll like full on like attack them. And you're like, what? That's crazy, because Neptune looks so calm, cool, collected in your videos. Okay, you guys only see like Neptune this much of the time that I spend with him, right? And I only will film him if he's in a happy mood, not when he's trying to bite me. Just like there are people who have veiled chameleons that are puppy dog tame. So I don't think you should base your decision on getting a veiled or panther based off of stereotype temperament, because it's a total, like it's 50-50 in my opinion on whether or not you're going to get a friendly chameleon or an angry chameleon. And I think you should go into purchasing a chameleon with the intention that they'll never want anything to do with you, because that's a very real possibility. If you end up with a friendly chameleon or a chameleon that's willing and wanting to be handled and tamed down, that's great, added bonus. But you shouldn't pick a species just because you think it'll be friendlier. So if you haven't figured it out already, I think price is a bogus reason to pick a chameleon, and I think temperament is a bogus reason to pick a chameleon. But what is a legitimate reason to try and decide between a veiled and panther is humidity, because a panther chameleon has higher humidity requirements than a veiled chameleon. So if you live somewhere that's super dry, just naturally is a dry climate, think of places like the UK or Colorado, just naturally dry environments, it's going to be much more difficult to provide the humidity levels that a panther chameleon requires. Just like if you lived in a super humid climate, say like Florida, for example, where it's naturally very humid, that's going to be much more difficult for you to provide the drier conditions that a veiled chameleon requires. So that would be a legitimate reason to try and decide between a panther and a veiled. If you're able to provide the humidity requirements for both a veiled and a panther chameleon, then what it really comes down to is which chameleon do you think looks the coolest? If we're being honest, like that's what it really comes down to, because their care requirements are very similar. Their space requirements are very similar. I don't think you should make a decision off of price. I don't think you should make a decision off of friendliness. Pick the chameleon that you think looks the coolest. That when you're scrolling through Instagram, you're like, oh my gosh, look at this one. When you're doing all your research and you see a picture of this one, you're like, oh my gosh, I gotta show all my friends. That's the chameleon that you pick. Whether it's the bright greens in contrast of the veiled chameleon, whether it's the rainbows and blues of a panther chameleon, whether it's the big casque that appeals to you of the veiled, or the smoother casque of the panther chameleon, pick the chameleon that lights your soul on fire, that motivates you, inspires you, and excites you to give them the best life possible. That's the chameleon that you get. Not the cheapest one, not the one that you can shove into the smallest enclosure, the one that you want to give the best life possible. That's what it comes down to. And that's how I ended up with a panther chameleon, because when I saw one on the internet, like my mind was blown. And the rest is history, right? I just fell in love, and that's how I got started with chameleons. There was tons of information about panthers. I knew I could get them from a good breeder. I was able to provide the space that they needed, the humidity requirements. I liked the colors of the male. I liked the size of the males. And now we have Neptune. So hopefully now you can kind of understand why I'm recommending a male veiled or a male panther 3-month-old chameleon for a beginner chameleon, based off of my thought process. But if you want a female carpet chameleon, like by all means, just do the research required for that species. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Leave any questions or comments down below. I would love to know what your first chameleon was, so let me know in the comments. Feel free to subscribe so you know when I post a new video, and you can follow Neptune and all my chameleons on Instagram at Neptune the Chameleon. Thank you so much for watching, and have a good day. Bye! Why am I talking so slow? Can't talk. What's the word? If it's pretty easy for you to achieve the